Hey everyone. Today we're going to look at least 20 different ways that Google Search Console allows you, the SEO professional, to understand exactly how Google is crawling, or in other words, how they're seeing your website and the individual pages on your website. So, as you all know, crawling is one of the key, steps in the process of uh, classic SEO. So, from crawling to indexing to ranking, right? Those are the kind of the three general tenets of SEO. And crawling is a big one because it's where everything starts in terms of what Google needs to see on your website, which pages they need to be able to access, and ultimately how machine friendly all the content on these pages is, so that you can get full indexation and ranking credits within the anything that's algorithmic beyond that point. So everything starts with crawling. So let's look at all the different features within GSC that allow us to understand how our either individual property or domain level properties are being crawled. So we have the GSC interface here, and of course there's all of the typical crawling tools that are really above the fold and within our attention. But I'm going to start kind of flip that upside its head. I'm going to start here. So if you go under your settings, you can see that there's general settings about ownership and users, etc. But there is this actually links you out into very in-depth statistics and information about how Google is actually crawling your site. So first here we have uh, crawl stats, right? So this right here will take you into the crawl stats report, which is in its in its own a very rich source of reports and information. But here's another key one right here. So first we have indexing crawler, Googlebot desktop, which is very interesting, right? So this is a fairly new property, Timeless Basketball. It's a passion project of mine, so I don't mind sharing the kind of view here. But I wanted to call out specifically that, with all of the mobile first indexing that Google has shifted the web over to in recent years, I'm still surprised to see that there are certain properties that Google is still leveraging the desktop crawler as the primary source, or from a indexing standpoint, right? Like this is Google saying your desktop site is more important in terms of indexing and ranking than your mobile site, versus the what I would expect to see in most of pretty much 9 out of every 10 sites in my account here are all showing Googlebot mobile. But I am surprised to see this. uh, but hold this thought, there's more into this when we look at crawl stats. uh, Crawl stats, a very high level, you can see how many number of pages or URLs that Google has requested in total in the last 90 days. Um, and so let's go into that and look at these different views that are available to us. So at a very high level, we can see 8,140 crawl requests overall. So this is, in the last, looks like 3 months, 90-day period, Google averaged about 100, less than 100 URL requests per day. And so that's the total here. So even if if they crawled my homepage 10 times in this view, I can, all 10 of those requests are being docked and counted here. Then we have download size, right? So 230 million bytes is equivalent to what, 230 megabytes. And so the general idea here is that this is Google saying, okay, of all the HTML, of all the images, of all the other JavaScript and CSS files that we crawled and downloaded, this is the total of all of that. And so I know I don't have too many images and too many pages on the website, and so I'm not too surprised. 230 megabytes seems pretty accurate. However, if you're a large site, you have a lot of media, this number could very easily be into the billions. Average response time. So this allows us to see that when Google is crawling your site, generally, what is the response time that your host is serving up before Google starts to actually get any of the content in the, before all that starts to actually be pulled. First, it's the connection right between browser or between Googlebot and your host. And so, the lower this number is, the lower all of those other than subsequent metrics like, the content fetching metrics like LCP, FCP, right? All of those things will then come beyond that. So ideally, you can keep this number very low. If you keep it to 100 or 200 milliseconds, that's going to give you a huge advantage. Next, we're able to, like, going off of that note, we can see host status, right? So this is Google saying, okay, in the last 90 days, we've tried to crawl your site, and now here are the few things that Google wants to see if your site is at a high level, very accessible to them. So robots.text fetch. Google wants to see that every time they request this file, you have to have this acceptable fail rate, or you have to be below that threshold, right? So that threshold, it's hard to tell, but it's probably, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5%. Uh, I am registering it at 0%. So great. Google, the uptime for robots.txt file is always there. Um, the DNS resolution. So again, just that initial DNS connection, or this might be even before the, there's a response time that comes from the host. This is just making that initial connection uh, at the domain level. And then server connectivity, right? So this is then talking about the actual hosting. So if you ever, right, so we can see here, I do have, there was a day where I had 1.4%, still well below the threshold, but, and it was just a blip here, nothing persistent that I need to worry about or report up to my host. So again, just, this type of information Google never really gave you before. And so, for the really technical and complex SEOs out there who are managing large websites, and every bit of this insight can be then packaged into, performance improvements, technical debt reduction, right? Like all of those things to really clean up that experience for Google bots. We're able to get that visibility here. Then there's other breakdowns and very interesting ways to look at how, or what Google is getting when they're making these requests. So here, this one by response code, this is saying, okay, of all of these 140 requests that were made, 78% of them came back with a 200 status code. Great. Here's another 8% that had a 304 status code, 404, 301, and so on. So some of these I might want to be, I'm interested to say, okay, well, why am I getting these? Like, what's triggering these? And you can get that kind of insight here, right? So we can see Google here tried to request this. They give you the exact time and date. It's almost like if you were doing server log analysis, like on the flip side, as the website owners, you had a networking team that you're able to work with, and they're fetching these logs for you, server logs. Uh, they're giving you these types of things, right? They're giving you timestamps, the actual page or URL that was requested, the status code that was served up. And then Google is also telling you a couple other things here. So what is the file type? And what was the purpose of this? And then some of those other reports, you can see what these things mean. But, you can just see like how they were able to produce this error. And so that we then can, go in there and try to reproduce it and see if we're able to trigger the same. And if so, is there, are these good high performing URLs that actually need to be, cleaned up, or we need to remove these errors, or if it's just noise and you can safely disregard. But this right here, I think, gives you more visibility into like the crawl behavior than even the coverage report, which gives you all kinds of different, troubleshooting and diagnostics about the different types of response codes that Google is seeing. But this right here, again, at a very high level, does a great job. File type. So this is also very interesting, where you can see, okay, of all those web pages, how much of it is HTML, how much of it is JavaScript, how much CSS, right? And so possibly when, you're trying to make any performance improvements, these are some of the areas where you can say, okay, how do I reduce, uh, or knowing that I have like JavaScript as 21% of my requests, um, like, is that a good thing? We don't know. Is it just the fact that, every page on the site has some sort of, uh, JavaScript files and they all need to render? Uh, if so, then, it's, you can safely say, okay, well, my HTML to JavaScript ratio is pretty much 1 to 1 or slightly higher. And so that it's generally safe. There's nothing that's problematic. So again, just being able to see from a resource standpoint how much Google is actually able to get to, and again, the status code here, like, is Google getting 200 response? If you have a JavaScript first, like JavaScript uh, based website, like a React or Angular or Vue, and you are dependent on the JavaScript files to render properly, right? You don't want to see 404 in the major JavaScript files that are, generating content on the web page. Otherwise, you're not going to get the credit for it. So this is the type of, kind of insights that you can try to find if you do have sites that are very heavily relying on JavaScript to render content. Purpose. So this right here, it might vary, this ratio between refreshing the, Google's index versus discovering new URLs, right? So Google's saying 96% of the time they're just crawling my site because they want to see if content has been updated, or modified, which is already in the index that they need to recache, or it's brand new URLs that Google is finding, and now those are the ones that are being requested so that they can start adding these into their index. So you're able to kind of break these up into the different purpose. And then finally, by Googlebot page type. So here we can see what we just saw previously on the other screen was that desktop crawler is the primary crawler that Google is sending. However, that doesn't really align with this. It's saying that 35% of my requests are going to come from, are actually coming from the smartphone. So, uh, you know, I don't know if this number needs to get to a specific level before Google says we've officially moved you over to mobile first indexing. I'm surprised at why this is the case. Having said that, when I have this conflicting message, right, where desktop is primary crawler, but smartphone gets more crawls, more crawl requests, then I just have to assume, or take that to say my website, whether mobile or desktop, both need to be, perfectly optimal in uh, content parity, right? Everything that I'm able to see on my desktop, I want to see on my mobile device. Everything I can see on my mobile, I want to see on my desktop device. So as long as there's that 1-to-1 parity, you're not going to have too much ranking fluctuation between the two device types. Uh, this right here, page resource load. So this is it's kind of a bot, but it's not really. Google doesn't make it clear in their documentation. But what it does do, or what this is primarily meaning, is that this is when Google is rendering a page, and then we have these other file types, right? So the URL is requested, and then subsequently there's either JavaScript files, CSS files, images, or anything else that requires a secondary fetch in order to fully populate the content on the primary page. That's what this is. So page resource load. And the key thing here is to understand and make sure that, hey, all of this is 200 status code. Nothing is being blocked inadvertently or on purpose for Google. And so this is the crawl stats reports. Again, great to see that you could, splice this data in a bunch of different ways to really understand if there's a good, if your accessibility is where it needs to be with your hosting and your servers. So next, we're going to jump into the links report. So this is, Google is the ultimate crawler, right? Not just on your website, but on the internet as a whole. And so one of the things that they've not really given us too much leeway on historically is these external links reports. If I go into any one of these subset of reports, right now this site is it's still a baby, and there's not much done here in terms of doing any organic offsite backlinking strategies. None of that has been done. No outreach. But if I was a site that has a long history of being in Google, getting linked to from hundreds and hundreds of sites, maybe thousands, I can see that here, but I know that I'll be linked, or I'll be limited to only 1,000 rows. However, what I just found out recently is that this feature here, so when you first go into the links report and you click this drop down for exporting external links, you can see that there is a report for more sample links and latest links. So what Google does is actually it'll give you up to 100K rows of external links. And so what that looks like is you'll see, a CSV file or a .xlsx file that has up to 100K page level URLs that are linking to anywhere on your site. And so what that does is that whole limitation of 1,000 rows no longer applies, because I can now I can do a little bit of Excel magic and strip out everything after the top level domain, and I can roll up all of my individual backlinks into consolidated domain level. So I can say, hey, I have, in terms of actual referring domains, here are 5,000 that Google is telling me that they just most recently crawled. Or that when I'm looking at just evergreen, right, like just what are all the sites that are linking to me today and that are maybe that are still valid and in Google's index, right? So that tells me that there's an actual meaningful component to it. So I know that I can consolidate those and see those domains. I can disavow a bunch of domains if I wanted to, understanding that, if if I have 5,000 domains, I can run batch domain reports in Ahrefs, and I can, or other tools that will say, hey, this domain is toxic, or it has such low domain rating, and it's not worth it. You can then, if you feel like you've been if you know, not feel, if you know that you've been hit by some sort of a algorithmic penalty because of bad backlinking, you can use this to definitively go after sites that Google is actually telling you they're counting towards your rankings. So both of these reports, again, super helpful. And then if you wanted to individually now going to, okay, I want to look at my internal links. So I can go and see in total here. So Google will only give you 1,000 max. I don't have that problem. I only have about 100 pages on my site. And so, but it'll tell me relatively which sites or which web pages have the most internal links pointing to them. That doesn't tell me if these links are in the header or in the body of the page or in the footer. So it's just a static value and it's just a count. But still, relatively speaking, I know that I will want my most, my highest impression URLs to have as many number of internal link counts as possible, right? So I can, graph and categorize some of these pages to say, okay, here's all my category URLs, here's my homepage URL, and here's all my blog articles. And blog articles have an average or, like a median link count of X, and the total number of pages that I have on my site are Y. What is that percentage of, how easy am I making it for Google to click to my top content in, one click, two clicks, or three clicks at the most, right? So just trying to get those types of internal link insights to help you better architect and structure your internal link graphs. So there's that. Again, all that goes into crawling because, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. But then we go into, here's some things that Google doesn't tell you now that they used to from a crawling standpoint. So rest in peace to some of the tools that were retired with the Google Webmaster Tools being sunsetted. So there is the robots.txt file tester, right? So you'd be able to go in and just put a URL and say, hey, is this URL being allowed or disallowed by my robots.txt file? Is Google be able to access these pages or not? And so you could validate a lot of your assumptions, especially if you're using, like the wildcards and different regex functions within those line items. You can quickly validate those. There was the URL parameters tool, which you could, as a SEO professional, you know, without development help, you were able to tell Google, hey, crawl this, don't crawl this. These are just tracking parameters. Disregard those. Uh, these parameters are needed to filter, and navigate through the facets in the site navigation. So all of those things were like you were able to either explicitly or um, you know very gently ask Google to treat those URLs as such. I can imagine that it was probably a dangerous thing for a lot of sites if people didn't know what they were doing and they were just going in there and not selecting the right things. They were probably getting, large portions of their website. They were preventing them from being crawled. Uh, and now that Google's crawl technology and indexing technology have all improved so much, they're probably just saying, "Hey, you know what, it doesn't, it's too much power to try to give to the SEOs. Let's just take that feature away from them and rely on our technology." So those tools are all mostly gone. International hreflang, reports, those would be able to quickly tell you how many pages on different locales you're indexing, and having those annotations with hreflang tags. That visibility is a legacy tool, and there's, you're able to use that to some degree, but I think this is one that will eventually make a comeback. I think If Google's shown us anything like with the crawl stats report, they might bring it back and make it even more meaningful in how you read and use the international targeting features and capabilities. Next, we'll look at security issues. So, security issues is not really a big deal until it is. Oftentimes, what I've seen is Google is able to find. So, as they're crawling my web pages, if I have a client whose security measures are not firmly optimal, and they get hacked, and there is content that's injected and hidden from the naked eye, but it's in the source code, Google is able to immediately flag that to say, okay, your content has been hacked. There is, links are injected into the content, which are taking users to, you know, Viagra sites or pharmaceutical sites, porn sites, gambling sites, all of those not so family friendly types of websites. And so, you're going to get immediately demoted. And so those are some things that you might not necessarily pick up as you're trying to do your general, troubleshooting, like, hey, all my SEO metadata and accessibility and indexability and everything looks good. Why am I falling off the face of page one? Well, this is right here, is a place to check and understand why. Manual actions, self-explanatory. Uh, we'll now jump over to this portion of the GSC here, which are your enhancements screens. So this is Google telling you, hey, as we are crawling your website, we noticed that you have 113 pages and you have all of them showing valid breadcrumb schema. So all of these experience or enhancements features are your opportunity to tell Google or to provide them machine friendly schema and try to put yourself in a position where you can warrant and earn organically rich snippets, feature snippets, um, video carousels, all kinds of special treatments within the search results pages. You can get those. The more of those that you mark up properly and correctly, not just with schema, but good, valid, semantic HTML, so that Google also understands the hierarchy of content on the page. Those types of things will help you understand that you are doing the right things fundamentally. And so being able to, if you see red or yellow here, Google is very good about giving you. Right now, I don't have any issues, unfortunately, to share. But upon clicking a URL, which is either red, green, or yellow, you can get instant feedback almost. Google's right here telling you, okay, here's your source code. Here's the where it's picking up the schema from. So if there's any video schema issues, or if there's, again, depending on the type of schema, if there's certain requirements that are missing or other warnings that just need to be addressed, those are, outlined here for you to either fix or improve to put yourself in the best position to take over the real estate, all forms of real estate on the search results page. Next, we're going to look at the experience report. And this is very quickly, not necessarily just so page experience report here, right, is an aggregated view of both the core web vitals report and the mobile usability report. And so you're able to kind of see, okay, what is my speed? What is my, do I have errors in what my mobile web pages look and how they function? And so here I can get just high level view of that. Great. I have, 97% of my mobile URLs are all good. And, um, and so maybe there's some ranking benefit to it. But generally, I'm just happy that my, you know, that competitively I'm faster than my key competitors here. But if, let's say, they weren't so good, right? I used to have be in the yellows and uh, needed to, try to improve there. We could go into these reports to say, okay, Google, when you crawl these URLs, um, what is it that you're seeing? And so you're able to, at a high level, like Google will aggregate this information. So now you're able to say, okay, so this type of URL here is my blog post URL, right? There's no slash category slash something. This is just what my URL structure looks like for individual articles. Google tells me there's 107 of them, and all of them have an aggregated LCP of 2.2 seconds, CLS of 0.01 seconds, and this is not the time that it takes Googlebot to necessarily render the speed. It's not how fast the bot clocks in at. It's about actual real world users, and about 75% of them, and how what their experience was in the last 28 days, depending on whether they came in from mobile or they came in from desktop, right? So the Chrome UX report can give you even more further information, like are these users coming in from 3G connections, 4G connections, 5G connections, the different types of devices and browsers that they're using. All of that is tracked in the Chrome UX report and aggregated for you to be able to see a large sample, large subset and cohorts of users and what they're experiencing. Okay, so then from a crawling standpoint, you know that there's all of these different features that we have here, right? So you have straight up red errors. These are the 404 errors, the 500 errors that Google is saying, hey, no, we're trying to crawl these pages. We're not getting to them. You need to immediately fix them either through a redirect or by restanding the page back up or by, preventing any bot blocking mechanisms in place. So this is a great place to troubleshoot. Um, there's also other types of errors such as no index meta tags, right? Or xrobots tags you might have that are throwing these errors. The point here is really just about accessibility and Google being able to not crawl something or not being able to index something. And so they want you to double check and make sure that that is intentional. So here's all my valid URLs. Here's my excluded URL. So this is where it could get very interesting, but also kind of dull. But if you're very technical and your site is more complex, every one of these things that you could find, could be very meaningful features and defects to clean up. So we can see here you have redirects that are counted, URLs that are crawled but are not indexed for one reason or another. There's the 404s. There is any canonical tagging. There's URLs that don't maybe are parameterized or they for whatever reason they have different pages. And so what those look like. Discovered but currently not indexed. So Google's crawled it. They're like, okay, we don't know if we trust this URL quite yet, but we want to, let it give some more time. Or there's other page level issues that are preventing Google from indexing. All right, so there's these wide mix of just different issues that, you know, the right thing to do would be to say, okay, I'm going to just go down this list and I'm going to just validate everything. I'm going to go into the specific reports. I'm going to look at these URLs. And I'm going to say, okay, these are generally all good URLs, or these are, hey, I need to take immediate action because we are shooting ourselves in the foot. Actually, I'm going to go back. So this is right here, just the coverage. Now you can do some, kind of accounting here. Because Google will give you several different or two types of reports. So this is all known pages and all submitted pages. all known as just Google, this is basically, they're adding your sitemaps, they're doing the normal crawl on your website, and or they might be getting backlinks on other sites that then take Google to your current site. So even if it's not linked anywhere, it's not in your sitemaps, it could just be legacy URLs. So Google is trying to then show you that this is everything they've ever known, and every URL that they're coming across on your site, versus these submitted pages are going to add up to, so there's 148. Chances are that this is the same number of URLs that are, excuse me, um, or so it's going to be this plus this, right? So the 148 are valid, 31 are excluded. Um, so that those are your sitemap URLs, and then that total number is also the total here. So it's 182 URLs Google is saying are submitted, and of those, 148 were in fact indexed. The other 31 are excluded for one reason or another. So you might want to reconcile those 31 and either take action or just remove them from your sitemaps entirely, so that again you're keeping your sitemaps lean and clean. It doesn't really matter for small sites as much as it would if you had larger sites with tens of thousands of URLs and you wanted to ensure that Google crawled where you wanted them to crawl, and not so much low value or no value to SEO pages. Removals. So this isn't really as much a crawling thing as more as an indexing thing. So we can look at this feature later. But the note here is if you remove something from this submitted URL, if you put a request in here and let's say there's a subfolder you block out, the number of crawl requests now that Google will make to that same subfolder or any URL that follows that subfolder structure are going to be minimal at best. Or they're going to, try to stop crawling those entirely. And so then we are going into, last but not least, the URL inspection tool. So this tool in itself is a gold mine, because not just it's not about just, okay, can Google crawl my page? Can they index it, right? So there's some of those basic diagnostics, and you can see those immediately here. The URL is already on Google. You can say, okay, what's the if you were to look at the code of that page, what's the HTML that Google has cached in the index today? What files were they able to, um, what files did Google try to access, and how successful were those? So these types of things here, so page resources, right? We talk about like we have phone, or we have photos that are maybe responding differently based on like browser size and mobile device. But for one reason or another, Google couldn't see that these specific images were being rendered, or they couldn't load those in parallel ports. You can also see, again, just some of the coverage information, like, okay, is this URL in any of my sitemaps? Are there, if sometimes this isn't the case, it's the URL is not in the sitemap, you could also look at the referring page here, because Google will give you just like a sample URL, or if there's only one URL, you'll get a refer here to say, okay, this is where this page is linked from, at the very least. Last time it was crawled, what browser or what user agent Google used to make that crawl. Crawl allowed, yes. Page fetch, successful. Indexing allowed. So this is just Google looking at all the different, X robots, meta robots, robots that text, and I suppose canonical URLs in order to say yes, 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 everything here checked off successfully. And so you could really just do that individual page analysis. Where it gets really interesting is, so now you can also do like a live test URL. What's important here is, imagine if you're working on a new website and you're doing a JavaScript site migration, for example, and it's going to be a risky move to try to switch over. And so the main thing you want to do with web migrations like that is ensure that your content on the old site, the legacy site, is as good and crawlable on the new web page, the new equivalent page. Uh, and so, if again, if it's a JavaScript site, you might have the same word for word content on the pages, but if Google's not able to actually render that JavaScript or parse it properly, then to the bot, maybe a portion of the page, or sometimes even the entire page, is now wiped out. And so it's a thinner page now, or it's a blank page in some cases, very extreme cases, but it does happen. And so obviously you're going to lose all your ranking factors and signals. And so this right here is a great place to, you can add a staging subdomain or subfolder or something to, usually a subdomain, but you would add that as an individual property that you generally have it so that it's not, the content is not indexable, but the page, in fact, is accessible to Google, and it is, the URL is able to serve up a proper 200 status code, and then it'll tell you all these things, right? So then you can do a live test, and on that live test, you can do, you can inspect the HTML, and I can go down the list or go down this scroller here and see that all this content is in fact in standard HTML. I can see, it's all optimal content and the way that it's rendering. But if you often have JavaScript sites, you might not see HTML here. You might see all of this content, but it comes in the form of XML data, and if the client side or the server side rendering JavaScript does not flash the XML data as HTML content on the page, that's where you lose the credit for ranking. So again, you want to do is, especially when you're doing those types of migrations, validate that the code, right? So what I would do is I will say, okay, what's my title tag? And then I'll just copy that text and I'll paste it in here and see, okay, does it take me to a valid title tag? Yes. I'll take a random H2 heading text right on the page and say, okay, I'll just do a quick H2, and then see that, yes, it is in fact in HTML. So ultimately, like, this right here tells you, hey, the question isn't, does Google process JavaScript? The question should be, does Google properly crawl JavaScript on my site, on my web pages, the way that I have them built and coded and developed? Is Google able to actually parse it and render that content in full here? And so this is the source of truth for you in that respect. One thing that's limited right now that I wish Google did fix is the screenshot. So it'd be great if Google could show you the full page. Right now, they only show you whatever the above the fold snapshot is. And in my case here, you can see that it wasn't rendering the images here properly. And so there's no image here. The logo is not loading. But that at least gives you some inclination, hey, that maybe something is wrong and that you need to, take a look at the site and make sure Google is in fact able to get to the resource that we want them to get to. So, again, there's a lot of things here that depending on different page types, right, you can look at the enhancements in inverse. So instead of going to each type of enhancements and saying, okay, am I red, green, whatever, you can say, okay, if I'm looking at my product page, I know that I'm going to have maybe some organizational schema. I'm going to have some product schema. I'm going to have, ratings, reviews, all of those things. I'm going to have pricing in stock, just overall availability. I'm going to have breadcrumb schema. Um, and also like, hey, this particular page, it's, uh, how fast is it loading? Is it a good URL in Core Web Vitals? All of those things will be laid out here for me in the enhancements. So, if there's particular page types that are my highest traffic drivers, and I see that there's enhancements issues, I can prioritize those fixes and optimizations, um, and make sure that Google is able to crawl all of that successfully, and the syntax in the schema itself also makes sense, right? There's no major errors, and there's no major um, there's no warnings that are going to set me back. So those are all the different use cases that Google Search Console offers us for understanding how Google, their different crawlers, are able to crawl our pages, and how much of the content is being able to actually be rendered. And so that ultimately, then all of that determines what gets indexed, and then eventually what gets ranked. So don't take crawling for granted, and how Google crawls. Uh, make sure you're doing regular, frequent health checks in here to make sure that there's optimal crawling. Don't just wait for algorithm hits or things to go wrong before you start to troubleshoot. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, uxseo.com, where we have more GSE tutorials for advanced and new practitioners alike. Thank you.